I want to thank you, Christy and Karen, for that beautiful rendition of that beautiful song. More is, I think, the sentiment of everyone. Your voices are beautiful together. Let's hear more. Recently, I was reading the book God Alone, which is a collection of letters from Sister Gyanamata, who was Yogananda's most advanced woman disciple. She died just a few months before he did in 1952. She was a woman of great spiritual understanding, and she wrote many letters to her brother and sister disciples, which are published in that book. It's really an extraordinary book, except for the writings of Master himself and Swamiji. I think it's the finest spiritual book there is. And at the beginning of it, they have several pages, which is a transcription of the talk that Master gave at the funeral celebration of Sister's passing. That's what he called her. He always called her Sister. She was a number of years older than Master himself. So Sister was in her 80s when she died. And they had an extraordinarily close relationship. And in fact, she died in November, and Master died in March. So it was like once she was off the planet, he really wasn't going to stay long either. Excuse me. In that talk, he cries out in what can only be described as grief, and he speaks so sadly of the fact that she's gone and he's left behind. And Swami Kriyananda, who was present on that occasion, talked about how Master, just tears were streaming down his face as he talked about the death of his disciple. Now, on a certain level, one can't help but be confused by such a demonstration of grief, because also Master said that he had held her in the body, that he had made a covenant with Divine Mother that Sister Gyanamata would live as long as Master wanted her to live. And he said about her in that story that she had no karma of her own. Even though she was ill and struggled physically for some 20 years, Master said that all the karma that was running through her body was the karma of others, that she was working out for them. And by taking it upon herself, she was freeing them spiritually. She was, in fact, the guru of a number of people for Master, but through her. And Master said that when Sister Gyanamata died, he saw her soul completely liberated, merging into the infinite, that all her struggle on this plane of existence was done forever, and it was eternal bliss for her from that point forward. And Sister Gyanamata's own last words were, joy, joy, too much joy, just before she died. And yet, Master still spoke, as any human being would speak, about how bereft he felt and how lonely this world would be without Sister in it. And as I said, tears ran down his face. Now, I've contemplated this a great deal, because nothing that Master did was for any reason except to set for us the right example of how to perfectly balance the spiritual and the material in this world. To move to another reality, which I'll knit together in just a moment. I remember when I was confronted once with the realization that a great fault in myself, which I thought I had overcome, was in fact still strongly present in me. I'd merely separated myself from the circumstances that activated it. And in that physical freedom, I thought I had attained spiritual freedom. And in fact, I was so confident that I walked right back into those circumstances thinking that it wouldn't touch me anymore. And in a matter of about 20 minutes, I was just flat on the ground again with all of the karmic annoyance and fury and triggers, everything that had bothered me for many years. And I was so humiliated. I was so embarrassed. I was so disappointed. Another level of putting it was I had been so proud of my victory, and now that victory had been taken away from me, and tears were running down my cheeks. I was in the car with Swamiji, and I was sobbing about how I so thought I was free, and now here I am again in this. He was very matter-of-fact about it. He said, well, it's good that you know you weren't putting out any energy to overcome it, and there was still a lot to learn, so now you can get to work. Just as casual as that about it. Now, in another context completely, and again, I'm going to knit this together, Swamiji was talking about a certain devotee that he'd been trying to help, the first that I had been trying to help for a long time without any success at all. And he also, the person came to him for help, and the person had an inclination to cry a lot. And crying often interrupted the progress of whatever progress we might be making. And Swamiji made a very interesting comment. He said afterwards, because he commented that they only went a certain distance because then the tears made it impossible. And he said, I felt them to be tears of anger, he said. So even though I was sympathetic, he said, I didn't express my sympathy. Anger at the circumstances the person found themselves in, the state of rebellion against what is. Why are things like this? They should be different. I'm reminded in this of little Michael Kieran and they were living, the family was living in the ashram in San Francisco. We had a 5-story house that was not well insulated for sound. And he was tired of being in bed early one morning. He crawled out of bed about 3 in the morning. He stood at the top of this very wide staircase that went through the whole house and shouted so that he woke everybody up. I want it to be morning, he declared like that. He was like, where is everybody? I am bored and I am wide awake. Those are the kind of tears we have sometimes. I want it to be different. You know, I find myself in a circumstance. So there I am weeping. I find myself in a circumstance. Now my tears were of a different order. And a few years later, many years later in fact, Swamiji had to scold me very sternly for something that I had done that was in fact, my own responsibility. And I accepted it, knew it was true, and I had an inclination to cry. I used to cry a lot more. And he just looked at me after he told me the facts, and he said, now don't cry, just like that. And for about 3 days, we were in Assisi when this was happening in Italy. For about 3 days, when I was a child, I saw a cartoon of Tom and Jerry, the cat and the mouse, which I had always remembered because it was, the mouse was trying to get I don't remember who was, it must have been Tom Cat and Jerry Mouse. The Tom Cat, the mouse was trying to sneak somewhere and the cat was determined that he wouldn't. And it meant that the cat had to stay awake for days and days and days somehow. And there were all these different methods the cat used to keep his eyes open. And the one I loved was he took his eyelashes and he put Scotch tape on his forehead. Like that. That's always stayed in my mind. I must have been like 5 when I saw that cartoon, but I can still see his little eyelids taped up. Well, when Swami told me not to cry, I felt like I had like Scotch tape, like I'd Scotch taped my eyelids here, because the way I could sort of keep from crying was I kept my eyes open really, really wide. So for about 3 days, I walked around like this, because my tears were always self-pity. Oh, poor me, I've tried so hard. I'm so sincere. Swamiji lived for many years at Crystal Hermitage, and for a period of time, the whole house, which is now Crystal Hermitage, was just the dome. And if you look at the way the dome is constructed now, if you stand back far enough, you realize that there's the round building inside, and there's literally a roof over the building, like an umbrella. That's because that round building was absolutely impossible to seal against the rain. It was built, the whole house was built for $5,000 a number of years ago. It was spray foam, it had been shingled, it had been repaired in every possible way, but the dome would breathe and shift, the triangles that were holding it together, and it would always make new cracks. Swami said for many years they kept trying to fix it. He kept saying, just put a roof over the dome, just put a roof over the dome. No, they had this method and that method for 15 or 20 years. Finally, they just put a roof over it. But at the height of its sieve, of its incarnation as a sieve, literally so much water would come in. This was in the very primitive days, and there was a trap door in the floor. We'd go under the house where the firewood was stored, and you'd bring the firewood up and keep it going. This was the really early 70s. And once there was so much water, we just opened the trap door and we swept the water under the house because it just poured in from God knows where. And Swamiji decided, often he would make fun of the attitudes we would have. Seriously. He would do them in a mocking way, and then it would be hard. He wouldn't be mocking you, he would just mock the attitude in a neutral moment. And when he was in the midst of all of this, he sort of went into this very dramatic, "Dear Lord, I'm so sincere. Why don't you keep the rain out of this house?" And he realized that you can be as sincere as you want, but if there's holes in the house, the rain is going to come in. God is not punishing you. He's just responding to what's happening. And all these tears, no matter how many of them you shed, and I shed a lot, I know we all do, women have a good cry. That's oxymoronic if you think about it, a good cry. Women are more inclined toward it than men. Men have the same attitudes, they just show it differently. But the good cry for me was always, "Oh, poor me, I try so hard." But the problem, you see, that was always a substitute for the effort required to actually become different. And the word self-pity didn't cross my mind for many, many years. I just thought I was being so sincere, just like Swami and all those leaks in his house. I was so sincere. Look how deeply I'm trying. Look how much I want to change. And the proof of it was always those tears. Or alternatively, as the other devotee expressed it, these tears of anger, needs to be different. And all of this energy and willpower just spinning in a circle like that, after which you're exhausted and in exactly the same spot. Now, Master's tears were of a completely different order. This world it's so poignant is the only word I can think of. We often talk about the suffering inherent in this life, and God knows there's plenty of it. A very dear friend who lives over on the coast, many of you know her, her beautiful son was killed last week, driving a motorcycle on his way home. His life was taken. Anna Ania's son, Sal. Just like that. Beautiful man. You look in his eyes, you can see he was just an angel. I didn't know him personally. But just like that. You hear about it, I heard about it. You can hardly breathe. You don't know where to go with such a thought. Parents devote so much to bringing their children up, and just on the edge of being able to step into his own life, suddenly, unexpectedly, the incarnation is over. You can stand back and say, God knows what he's doing. The soul has its own destiny. I can articulate it extremely well. You can articulate it here, and your heart breaks here. And in a very real sense, that's what Master was showing us. Master was showing us that true devotion to God, true spirituality, doesn't make us cold. It doesn't make us less feeling, just the opposite. We're even more just deeply and sensitively aware of all the nuances of this life. Now, the relationship between sister and master is very hard even to imagine, the way it's described, because of course it happened before I never saw it. But sister rarely spoke in master's presence, and often he really rarely spoke to her. Whenever he came into a room, she would stand up, usually stand in the background, and usually stand silently. Sometimes he would hardly look at her. But as one of the disciples mentioned, she was in a room once, master walked in, just walked over, looked out the window for a moment, smiling kind of quietly, turned and walked out. And then the devotee said, but she had a feeling that a deeper conversation had taken place between them than anything that could ever have been said with words. And so we can hardly even imagine how profoundly their souls touched, and how much she helped him in his mission, and how grateful he was for the enormous self-sacrifice of even of her body, of her comfort, of her freedom, which she could have had long ago, but instead she gave that to Master. She gave that freedom to him. You know, how can you not weep? But those kinds of tears, those are the kinds of tears that wash the heart clear of all limiting conditions. Those are the tears of true devotion and of true freedom. So we have a very razor's edge that we have to walk in this life. Recently I was in Dallas for 4 days. We did the Texas premiere of Finding Happiness. That's what we grandly called it, because if you're in Texas, everything has to be grand. So we showed it in Dallas. We had over 300 people, very, very enthusiastic. This is the movie we've just released about Ananda. It's a beautiful movie. We're showing it in Palo Alto on the 11th and the 14th at the Aquarius Theater. Buy your tickets now. And as part of that, I gave a Saturday seminar of the same name, Finding Happiness. And I tried to think before, you know, we want to have some kind of a program that comes after this movie, because the movie really lays in front of people the basic principles that make Ananda what it is, and we want people to be able to follow up on that. But this is a dilemma I've been facing all this time. That can't be a superficial program, because it would be a lie to tell people, oh, just have positive thoughts, be cheerful, pray to God, and everything will be fine. Because your son may still be at a certain moment, and it's time for his soul to leave its body. And just mere good times will not give you what you need. And if we're going to find happiness, we have to really be able to find it. We're not talking about just rearranging, as Swamiji said, making the mud puddle in which we live a little bit tidier. We're talking about transcending this altogether. And there were a number of principles that I came to, 5 in fact. But the second one was karma. Because unless and until we really understand that this world is operating according to a divine law, and everything that happens here is in perfect harmony, at least until we don't rebel against that idea. Now, I think to fully embrace that, you know, speaking of the untimely death of one's own child, there are times, we used to joke about this, when true spiritual advice is still irrelevant. At such a moment is not the time for platitudes. Those are the moments when we have the kind of tears that Master has, which is just this poignant awareness of how mysterious this world is, and how difficult it is to fathom at times why we are drawn together, and what we're supposed to do, and how the melody that is our melody is supposed to play itself out. Sometimes there's a complete break in the music, and we have to stop and try to understand again. And But the qualities that make it impossible for us to go forward are tears of self-pity and the tears of anger. And whether they actually come forward as liquid cowardice, which is what Master called it. Tears are liquid cowardice on the battlefield of life. Oh, I passed over that one for about 30 years. I remembered it, but it was always not for me, not right now. But I've meditated on it a great deal because it has been because of the way Swami, pushed me on several occasions on that very point. Sooner or later, reality has to be faced. Swamiji said to try to affirm something away, he said, you cannot overcome a reality if you are not willing to face it. It's not the same to just paste on a reality and say, oh, it's really just fine. I remember a woman friend of mine was betrayed by someone very close to her. At least she felt betrayed. And she came to Swamiji, she was struggling to overcome it, and she said, well, I really thought about it, sir, and everything happened just the way it was supposed to happen. Which, in a certain situation can sound right. And Swami said, no, it didn't. Your friend behaved very badly. Just like that. He said, don't try to make yourself better, feel better, by embracing something that is false. He said, the way to transcend your suffering is to see reality exactly as it is, and then accept it, and then expand your consciousness beyond it. You see, when I was weeping in the car with Swamiji, I wanted to be free. I didn't want to be responsible anymore. I didn't want to have to drag through the muck of my own stinky attitudes. I was sick of them. I was ready to be done. And the thought that that was really who I was just made me literally collapse into tears. And Swamiji's thought always is, well, what can we do about it? If this is what we have, what are we going to do about it? And everything that we have, we have it. We can be sad about it, we can be angry about it, we can be pitiful about it. I used to get something I called the punies. Every so often I would get the punies, and I would say to David, I have the punies today, and I would just be really puny all day. Just make no attempt to be brave or serviceful or have right attitude, nothing. I was just going to have the punies, like a cold or the flu, a couple of days of sort of rebellion, and then I'd be done. That's a way to work with it. If that's how we feel, just give yourself the punies and have it for a while. But don't imagine even for a moment that God cares how sincere you are. What He wants from you is the courage to go forward. And you can't go forward except from where you're standing, so why lament it? Why be angry about it? We are responsible in the sense that our own wrong attitudes, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. In terms of finding happiness, until we understand that the law of karma is absolutely fair, insofar as we resist that thought, that is the measure of our suffering. And at a certain point, the misery we are experiencing is worse than what we think it's going to take to change ourselves. Until that point, as my dear friend Shivani said, don't even think about changing a personal characteristic until you're absolutely disgusted with it. Because you won't. But when you finally realize, this is not working for me, then all of a sudden, then God really hears you. All the anger, all the self-pity. But when a different kind of poignancy enters your heart. I love you, Lord. I live for you, Lord. We need to be different, and we're ready to do whatever it takes. Then He smiles at you, and His Master said once to one of His disciples, now we can get to work. And when he gets to work for us, that's when things really change. God bless you.